Good afternoon, everyone. It is 2 p.m. Eastern. My name is Maria Worthen. I am the Vice President for Federal and State Policy at INECOL, and I will be moderating this webinar today. As folks are signing in, I'll just make a few little housekeeping announcements before we get started. So again, this is the INECOL special webinar supporting educators transitioning to a competency-based and personalized learning system. As you sign in, I would invite you to introduce yourself. You'll see a chat window on the left-hand side. Please let us know who you are, where you're calling in from, and maybe something about what you're hoping to learn today. All of our webinars at INECOL are meant to be interactive, and we really do welcome you to share any questions you have for the presenters now or as they come up. And we will be monitoring the chat and responding as we can. And I will also be raising questions that I see during our Q&A portions of the webinar. But we do also encourage you, the participants, to engage with each other. If you have any information to share or reflections on what our hosts are talking about today, please don't hesitate to add your thoughts or share any resources, which will only enrich our conversation in that chat box to the left. And I see there are already some folks that are introducing themselves, which is terrific. Thank you for doing that. And then just as a housekeeping reminder, you can, if you're having any issues with audio right now, you can go up to that tools menu, select audio, and then audio setup wizard, just to make sure that your audio is coming through in an optimal way for this webinar. And just a reminder, your audio button, I believe, is disabled, but sometimes, just in case there are any glitches, make sure that those talk and video buttons are not toggled on so that we can have optimal sound quality. So, on that note, and please keep introducing yourselves, letting us know what you hope to learn. Today's webinar will offer a roadmap and possible on-ramps for transitioning from the traditional schooling model to a personalized, competency-based model. Our hosts, Jonathan Vander Elde and Brian Stack, will provide an overview of the hallmarks of competency-based education and a discussion of instructional practices and changes in grading and assessment. The discussion will center the role of collaborative teams and focused professional learning in supporting this transition. And then at the end, I'm going to wrap things up with a discussion of how state policy can support scaling the work that John and Brian will describe. So with that, let me introduce our speakers. Brian Stack is the principal of Sanborn Regional High School in Kingston, New Hampshire. Since 2010, he has been on the research, design, and implementation team for Sanborn Regional School District's nationally recognized K-12 competency-based learning system. He's a former high school mathematics teacher and has been a school board member for 3 different school districts in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. And furthermore, he is a nationally recognized consultant and speaker on implementing competency-based education across the United States. Our other host today is Jonathan Vander Elde. He is the Director of Innovative Projects for the New Hampshire Learning Initiative, which is an organization dedicated to seeding and supporting innovation and personalized learning in New Hampshire schools. Previously, John was principal of Memorial Elementary in Sanborn Regional School District in New Hampshire, where he transformed the school into a nationally recognized model professional learning community and competency-based school. He's also a nationally recognized expert on competency-based education and has been one of the leading figures in New Hampshire's Performance Assessment for Competency Education initiative. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John and Brian, and thank you so much for joining us, and I will hand the mic over to you.
Thank you very much, Maria. This is John Vander Elde speaking, and Brian and I are very pleased to share some of our learning with you and learn from you as we go through this next hour. As Maria said, I've been engaged in competency work for the past decade plus, both as a principal and also as someone who's providing professional development now to schools and districts across the country who are attempting to do some of these same things and helping to meet each student where they are. Again, we're very pleased to be here, and I'm going to turn things over to Brian to introduce himself, and then we'll get going.
Hello, everybody. I'm Brian Stack, and I'm really excited to be here. It is great as we're looking through the chat. We're seeing so many people from so many different states. Some people, a lot of people that we know, a lot of people we don't, so we're looking forward to getting to know you better as we spend some time talking about this topic for the next hour. As John mentioned, it's something that we're really passionate about, both from the professional end. We're both parents. We both have kids between the two of us, quite a few kids, 8, I believe, to be exact. We come from families of educators, and really we do this work because we're just really passionate about it. We believe truly and honestly it is the way to make a difference for our kids and help them be college and career ready and meet the needs of a brave new world. So we've been through a journey on our own with our own schools. We've also shared that journey and learned and grown with other schools around the country. So our hope today is to kind of share with you some of what we've learned along the way in hopes that you'll be able to make it better and then keep it moving. So,
thanks, Brian. As Brian said, we have been sharing our learning. One of the ways we've been doing that is through a book that we co-wrote together called Breaking with Tradition. And the basis of that book is that a shift to competency-based learning has to be done collaboratively and collectively, and that's what we're going to walk through today with you. We'd like to start out by just reviewing the definition of competency-based education that was developed with INACOL and Competency Works. Again, the first tenet is that students advance upon demonstrated mastery, and quite honestly, that's, for us, been probably the most difficult tenet to really become more successful at. We'll talk about entry points and what different entry points have been for schools that we work with as well as ourselves. But each place is different, and that's what we want to honor and respect and allow you to think about as practitioners and as educators in your own schools. The second design principle is around competencies themselves. So we need to make sure that those are explicit, measurable, and transferable, and that students are empowered through these competencies. The third one, which we're going to talk quite a bit about today, is the assessment design principle. And we think differently about assessment now than we certainly did when we started this journey. Assessment is really an integral part of the learning process, is meaningful, and is a positive experience. Many times when I work with schools and even with students and we ask about the word assessment, immediately teachers, any adults, and students go to testing. We want to make sure that assessment, again, is part of that learning experience and that we're honoring the formative and summative components of the assessment experience. The fourth tenet, which we'll talk a bit about, is one around the timely differentiated support. So whether students need intervention or extension, we're going to meet each student where they are. Again, you can see the correlation to this around students advancing upon demonstrated mastery, and we'll talk a bit about that learning that we've had. But again, this fourth piece is a critical component and is actually where we as a school started back when I was a principal. The last tenet of a competency system is around learning outcomes that emphasize competencies that are both academic and non-academic in nature. So in New Hampshire, we call those the work study practices, the non-academic competencies, things like communication, collaboration, creativity, and self-direction. We know that employers and just the real world is looking for students coming out of schools who have developed these skills. And we want to make sure in schools that we're helping our students to develop those as much as possible. A lot of the work that we've done here in New Hampshire has been focused on this particular design principle, and we've seen incredible outcomes and growth from our learners based upon this.
One of the things I want to point out here is if you're new to competency education and you're just getting started with the work, maybe you're just seeing this definition for the first time, of course it can look a little overwhelming, but I really want you, especially if you're new in the work, to think about some of the places where you might already be doing some of this work, or as we start to unpack some of these today, maybe you're doing some similar work, and what we're looking for, what you're going to be looking for, is some potential entry points to be able to start doing the work. Now, for those of you who have already been doing the work, one of the things John and I have discovered is we've yet to find a school or school district that claims that they are an expert and have figured out how to do all aspects of this perfectly. Everybody is looking to get better in one of these areas or in some way. So be thinking about where your next steps are going to come from and what your leverage point is going to be to help you towards that ultimate goal, which is helping our students.
Thanks, Brian. We're going to move into kind of the structural pieces that we really focused on within our schools. These are based off of really the professional learning community framework. A lot of the work that I'm doing with other schools in other states, as well as in New Hampshire, is really trying to develop these structures within schools to effectively support this work. So we want to highlight these three big ideas that can guide schools in their learning and connect those big ideas to what we as practitioners in the field did and are doing within schools to support this. The first one is really around the acceptance as learning. So learning is the fundamental purpose of the school. And so with that, we want to make sure that we're always looking at what we're doing and determining what's effective and what's really helping us support learning. Now, this seems like a pretty obvious thing, but many times when we start to talk about this particular piece with educators, some educators will say, well, they have taught certain curriculum, but students maybe haven't learned it. What we want to make sure of is that students have learned what they need to learn to be successful in moving forward. And this is really something that will tie into what we talk about in a few slides. Critical question number one, we have to be really clear about what it is we want students to learn. And in a competency system, again, if you go back to that second design principle and that the competencies are explicit, we're clear about what that learning really is and what it should look like. The second big idea is around a collaborative culture. So we believe that working collaboratively, both within teams and vertically across teams in a school, as well as across schools in a district, is the most effective way to not only learn, but to meet the needs of all of our learners. And in each of our schools, we had a very strong model of collaboration. And you can call it whatever you want, whether it's a professional learning community or a critical friends group, the teaming structure, whatever it is, that collaborative culture and that collective purpose are critical. High-performing teams can tackle this very difficult work more effectively than an individual.
Yeah, I just want to add into the piece of the collaborative teaming work. I can't underscore just how important and critical and necessary this is in order to be able to engage in all of this work. The things that we shared with you in the previous slide in the definition of competency ed are incredibly high-level ideas. They really do require the school to have a systems-wide approach to how they work with students and how they support students, especially with their varying needs that are going to change often. And if, as an individual educator, it can get overwhelming quickly if you don't feel that you have a support system where you work with a team and you have some level of decision-making power within your team to be able to operate. And so that has been important in all the schools that I've seen that are doing it effectively, and certainly in the school that I am currently, we work really hard at that. And it's never something that we consider to be checked off and perfect at, because dynamics always change. Team members will change over time. Needs change over time. And so you're constantly looking at how can we get better at that teaming piece, recognizing that it's just going to make us more efficient and more committed to the goal.
And this collaborative culture piece does not happen all by itself. It takes a lot of hard work and dedication from both team members and then the school as a system to highlight that collaborative work. And so we'll talk about some of the ways to try to frame that and to put guardrails into place that we've seen be successful so that the teams can actually focus on the things that they need to, which will impact student learning, which again goes back to big idea number one. The third big idea we want to discuss, and again, this is all based off of the work of Rick and Becky DeFore, Bob Baker, Thomas Minnie, and Mike Mattis, who have kind of framed this through the professional learning community at work process as the three big ideas. But the third big idea is around utilizing the results that we have, the data that we seek and then actually are looking at. How does that inform us about what our next steps are? To be really honest, that in our school, this was probably the most difficult piece that came along. I'm seeing in the chat a number of questions about how to do this effectively and what's the starting point. Like many teachers, our staff felt overwhelmed, and I would include myself in that, with the amount of information and data that we had coming to us and at us, whether that was statewide assessment data or summative other benchmark data that we were collecting on an ongoing basis, or just the day-to-day information that our teachers were collecting. It's hard to synthesize all of that, and again, this is where it ties back into the second big idea, without having processes in place that will allow teachers and teams to most effectively understand what it is they're seeing and then to make informed decisions based upon that. So that third big idea is very critical, but tends to come along a little later, because what happens, and what happened in our school and is happening in Brian's school as well, is that teachers start to seek relevant data, and that's where you know the assessment literacy of your teachers and teams has increased to the point where they know what they're looking for and are actually going back to their students and seeking out additional information to help them make decisions.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chat right now. Jan from Santa Barbara, this slide is for you. In my building, it was actually a two-person teacher team that single-handedly kicked off our work with CBE as a school. And really what it boiled down to was this slide right here and these three big ideas that we started operating with when we started our PLC work, which preempted our CBE work. These two teachers took this idea as the basis, the foundation for some of the CBE initiatives that they wanted to start. Now recognize 10 years ago, 12 years ago, there weren't that many schools doing it. We didn't have models to work off of, so they really were in brand new territory. But again, it was all about building up a team and a collaborative culture and having support from all levels in order to be able to make that work.
So we have the three big ideas, and again, these are bigger picture, and I want to touch upon something that we didn't necessarily start with, but is a great way to kind of frame some of this, and that's through a portrait or a profile of a graduate. The mission, vision, values, and goals, those four pillars of schools are critical. And if that North Star hasn't been identified, that mission piece, why do we exist as a school, then it can be very, very difficult when the going gets tough, so to speak, to have something to point to and say, remember, we did this because we're trying to ensure high levels of learning for every student in our school. And so we know through the data that we've been collecting that we haven't been doing that. And we have students that we're missing. And so again, that mission piece, why we exist, is critical. The values really go to who we are, what do we need to do as a school to get to that mission, to be successful. And then of course, these big ideas can help to guide that as well. Mm-hmm. I'd like to move into, I mentioned the second big idea in the collaborative culture, and Brian was talking about just how critical that was in a school, the question is, well, how do you frame that within the time that teachers have together? So during that collaborative time, I always think that if one of these questions that we're going to go through is being addressed, then the teams are doing the work of a professional learning community. They're doing the work that's going to allow them to reach each student where he or she is. The 4 critical questions, again, developed by the detours, as the work of a professional learning community. We're going to break these down a little bit and talk about how that might look within a collaborative team. And again, it doesn't matter if it's kindergarten, 3rd grade, 7th grade, 9th grade, 11th grade in a content area, or if it's a teaming approach, regardless of the level. If one of these questions or more are being discussed and analyzed within the team, then they're engaged in the right work. The first one, what is it we want students to learn? It's pretty straightforward. We had a question there from Jen Holmes regarding the difference between competencies and standards. It's a great question, and we struggled with that at the beginning, really understanding what that competency piece looked like. That first question is a curriculum question, and so in a competency-based system, and again, this ties to that second design principle, we need to be really, really clear about what it is students should know and be able to do. And so teams should be also very clear on that. That has to be determined first and foremost. The second critical question is an assessment question. How will we know if each student has learned it? When we're developing assessments, and whether they're common formative assessments or performance assessments, we'll talk more about that in the next slide, that assessment data can help the team to then make the next decisions and inform what their next steps are. But we have to have good ways to collect that evidence. Teams should be developing those assessments together. Teams should be looking at formatively, what are we collecting? How do we know where each student is? We feel very strongly in a competency-based system that a summative assessment, we should have a very strong idea of where students will be within that summative performance assessment based upon all the evidence we've collected prior to that. What's really important is then doing something in a timely manner with that evidence. So you are, as a team, collectively, providing the opportunity for students to demonstrate their learning, and then you're utilizing that information to then put interventions or extensions, whatever is necessary for each individual student. And again, this is where the teaming is critically important, because one teacher cannot do this as effectively by him or herself. So based upon that information that's collected through the assessment, this will trigger a tiered response. And when we're talking about different tiers, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, this would be the Tier 2 time. In a multi-tiered system of support, that Tier 2 time not only can provide intervention, but also the extension piece. But this is what is answered through questions 3 and 4. How will we respond if students haven't learned it? Well, if we deem that it's that important and students haven't learned it, we have to put an intervention into place. Concurrently, or likewise, how do we extend and enrich the learning for students who have already demonstrated their competency? If we have that evidence, we want to make sure that their opportunities for learning are deepened, and that they're provided that as well, those students who have that need. In our school, these, if you look at question 3 and question 4, these were the 2 cohorts of students who had plateaued according to any data that we were looking at. We had an at-risk population that was not making gains, and we also had a population of students who were above grade level who were plateauing. And so our aim, our goal, was to try to meet every student where he or she was and to provide the appropriate level of support so that each student could move forward. The 4 critical questions, again, are, for us, this guide to what the team should be really focusing on within their collaborative time.
Deb, you asked a great question a few minutes ago about needing PLC work, and what do you suggest, where do you suggest you start? And actually this slide, I think, can give you some good insight, because to me, it's all about developing purpose for the work and some trust for the work and giving people some direction for the work. So you know, one thing that we did at our school, and remember, I was at the high school level, and I don't know what level you're at, but for us it was converting our traditional department model into more of a PLC model. So when we first moved to the PLC approach, of course, we were departments by a different name. We didn't have that purpose piece. And so there was a day we had a staff meeting. We asked staff to identify all the kinds of decisions that have to be made in a school. And then we said, well, of all these decisions, and there are lots of decisions here, how many of them would go into the bucket where we would want collaborative teams of educators making those decisions, as opposed to individual teachers, or as opposed to building or district administrators. And after people started putting all of these questions into that bucket, what they started to realize is that all of the questions going into that bucket fit perfectly with these 4 critical questions of the PLC. And that became our purpose. And we committed to that, and we said, well, then here it is, folks. As a school, we're going to commit that when it comes time to talking about these items, that work happens in a PLC, and as a principal, we're going to support that.
Absolutely. We would love to hear, so this is what has worked for us, is providing teachers with kind of, love the use of the kind of the analogy of guardrails, right? So if we're thinking about guardrails as the work has to exist between these kind of barriers, what might it look like in between? And the guardrails provide the structure, but the work that teachers do might look really different within their time. For example, you might have a team who's focusing on developing an assessment together collectively and collaboratively to assess a specific competency or standard. And again, the question came up about the competencies and standards and what the difference is. And the competencies are really that bigger idea. Within our book, we break down and provide examples of how standards flow into competencies. And so, again, the competency is this bigger idea, and it definitely has more depth, more meat. We would define that as the competency itself as kind of a higher level. So if you think about the competency as an umbrella, the essential standards are going to flow into that competency. And so within assessments, we may be assessing at the standard level, but they'll report out within a competency.
Yeah. No, I don't have anything to add to that. I was looking at the chat log, and just a quick answer to a question. It doesn't apply to this slide, but how does CBE connect with college admission? We've just always been transparent with colleges and universities. At my high school, I had 70 college admissions officers in my building this morning for a college fair, and we talk about CBE, and there are never any concerns that there are things folks don't understand or that in some way it isn't going to link well with college admissions process. So that answer might look a little different depending on different parts of the country, but I think the key is when you have secondary schools and higher ed institutions working together and communicating around these ideas, you don't tend to see an issue. So on that note, I think we'll jump into...
Yeah, I want to love to hear from everyone who's participating, kind of in between this slide and the next slide. We talked a lot about how we try to frame for our teachers how to engage in this work, but we'd love to hear how you and your schools are finding success within that. So if you could share that within the chat, that would be great. Again, we kind of framed the work of the collaborative teams in the school with the 3 big ideas and the 4 critical questions. If you could share how you approach supporting teachers within that collaborative work, that would be great. We're going to move to just an example. So for us, what really was a leverage point was performance assessments. Maria, in her introduction, mentioned that both Brian and I have been involved in PACE. PACE is really a learning system, but was also utilized as an accountability system for the state of New Hampshire. And Brian and I were both principals and principals of schools who were part of that initial year, and the schools are still part of performance assessment for competency education. And through the use of performance assessments, we found that our teachers, again, assessment literacy increased, but this process tied together all the aspects of a competency system. We're going to talk about that piece as just an example of an entry point that can help folks be successful. There are three, and you can see the visual here. This is from our friends at the Center for Collaborative Education. And so kind of the backstory of this is we had transitioned to a competency system, but some of our assessment practices, I would say most of our assessment practices at our elementary school hadn't really changed significantly yet until we went to training around developing performance assessments. And you can see the definition there of, true competency is this ability to transfer. And so performance assessments by nature require the transfer of learning. This demonstration of learning in a new problem, something that maybe hasn't been seen by the student yet, but will require them to access these skills that they've developed and been learning to apply toward that problem. So there are three major components of this. First is the task design. The task design piece of it really, again, should be done collaboratively. So if you have teams of teachers who are developing these tasks together, they're all on the same page about what they're looking for, at least they should be. They'll begin to develop a common understanding about what competency or proficiency, whatever term is being used, looks like, and they have to be clear about what it is they're expecting students and learners to demonstrate. What we found is that we were developing, this is in the beginning, but we were developing these tasks, and then the students were having a very difficult time with them. They weren't being successful with them in the beginning. But this was a great learning experience for our teachers, because what they recognized and realized is that although they've developed this new assessment, and now we're going to drop down to the quality-aligned instruction point of the triangle, their instruction and the rigor of the instruction and the ability for students and opportunity for students to practice at that level of rigor hadn't changed. And so now their instructional practices started to change as well. Now this rigor piece is absolutely critical. So we would point to Karen Hess's rigor matrices as tools that have been incredibly helpful for us. Dr. Hess's rigor matrices combine Webb's depth of knowledge with Bloom's taxonomy. And those helped our teachers to really not only develop the assessment, the rigor in the assessment, but also think about how they could support that level of rigor within instruction. The third point of the triangle, so the upper right, is really around that data analysis. And I want to go back to what we talked about with the teams. This part of the process, I don't think Brian and I can overstate. The opportunity for teachers to sit down together and to look at student work and begin to develop inter-rater reliability through various processes and protocols is some of the best professional development that our teachers said they've had. And that's just them sitting with their colleagues, kind of, again, thinking about those guardrails. Guardrails were in place, but the work that happened in between those guardrails was unique to the team. What happens in a school and within a district that can be incredibly powerful is when we start to look at this vertically. So we begin to develop inter-rater reliability not only within individual teams, but also vertically as well. Rigor, again, can drive that work, and the students will respond in kind.
I will tell you that the performance assessment piece was probably one of the easier sells when we were doing this work with our community, with our students and parents and teachers, in terms of the work ahead. There was absolutely no doubt in anybody's mind that engaging in more performance assessment work was going to make everybody better, educators as well as students, but really that powerful piece was being able to find the time for the teachers to really engage in that, looking at student work and refining the task piece. So it goes right back into the professional learning community model process, and really back on the building level administrators to be thinking about how you use time, how you provide time for folks to be able to collaborate. It really is your most important commodity that you have to work with.
The next slide really starts to focus on, again, what do we do with this information? If you think back to the fourth tenet of a competency-based system, it's specific to interventions and extensions, and it's really kind of providing each student what he or she needs. So if we've engaged in a process within a unit of study or collected information about where our students are, and we find that students are struggling, we need to have something in place to support those students. And so this particular slide, if you think about this, many of you are probably familiar with the pyramid of interventions, which used to be flipped around. It was pointing up. The issue with that was that schools believed that that pyramid was really a ladder to special education. So it was a pathway to identification for students who are struggling. And that's not the purpose of this. We want to provide timely, differentiated support for students and provide each student what he or she needs to be successful. So this visual really looks at that all students piece. That's a tier 1. So that's what every student is going to get as part of their learning experience. And that would be the, if your school is broken up by grades, those would be the grade level competencies and essential standards or power standards. Every student would have access to that. What happens in many schools is that students are pulled out of that time for additional support. But it is imperative that every student have access to those grade level standards. That these students portion of that triangle is really tier 2. And so based upon what students have struggled with potentially, within that tier 1, there should be a time allocated that would allow students to receive the specific support based upon where they are, so that that support is based off of a struggle or information, if it was an intervention, the teachers have collected during that tier 1, and again the extension is also a part of that. Down to this student piece, that's a tier 3, and that's based upon a smaller percentage of students, but students who might be struggling and maybe more than 1 or 2 grade levels behind. And so that's in addition to the tier 1 and tier 2. It's not in place of. And so that fourth tenet of a competency system, again, speaks to this piece. We tried to frame this so that everyone could see kind of from the work of the collaborative teams comes, and if they're focusing on the 4 critical questions and they're looking at the results of assessments that their students have been engaged in and have had administered to them, questions 3 and 4 come from this. And this kind of visual outlines what that could look like and is how we approached it in our schools. What we'd like to do is kind of wrap back around for this first initial part and connect back to the design principles that are outlined as part of a competency-based system. And so that first one, students advancing upon demonstrated mastery, we see a real clear correlation to the critical questions 3 and 4. What do we do if critical question 3, again, as a reminder, what do we do if students haven't learned it? And question 4 is, what do we do if they already know it? So we need to meet students where they are and allow them to demonstrate their mastery and allow them to move forward. The second tenet around competencies, that's really the what. What is it that we want students to learn? What should they know and be able to do as a result of this, this unit, this grade level, this course? That has to be clear by all teachers who are part of that team. The assessment piece critical is really around critical question number 2. And again, how we know if they've learned it. We'll know as a team by collecting evidence across many different areas. So we're going to, and again, I would add here that student self-reflection and students being aware of where they are. So this whole metacognitive piece, which ties in again to the learning outcomes that are referenced in Design Principle 5, that assessment piece is answered through critical question number 2, how we know. Again, it's by that collection of meaningful evidence through positive learning experiences. Design Principle 4, again, we just kind of touched upon, but that's really specific to questions 3 and 4. Again, just to reiterate, what do we do if they haven't learned it, and what do we do if they already know it? We have to put something in a place that meets those needs for students, regardless of where they are in their progression of learning. And then again, that last, the 5th design principle is around those competencies like communication, collaboration, creativity, and self-direction. We have to be clear about where those fit in too. And with a lot of the work that we're doing with schools around performance assessments, we're asking teams to be clear about which one of those, whether it's self-direction, it depends on really what's being asked of the student, but to identify that and to start to think about what success will look like, and to make sure that students are aware of that themselves and are making goals, developing goals, and then monitoring and adapting those goals. Again, those are the components of metacognition that will be critical to help that student be successful.
Maria, thank you for posting those questions in the chat just so people can look at those and the correlations between them. I guess all I will say about this is, you know, the PLC work, it's really about a culture of how you're going to approach work, and CBL really gave, for my folks in our school, gave us the purpose of what we were going to focus on, whereas that PLC process was the why we were going to do it and the how we were going to do it, and so these two things really did fit together perfectly.
Yeah, and the same thing was true for our school. Our goal, you know, what we had envisioned was meeting the needs of every one of our students, and we believe that by nature a competency-based and personalized system will do that. That's the intent. We're going to take a quick break here to look at any questions you guys have. And Maria, I guess I'll ask you if there's anything that you've noticed that maybe we've missed or haven't touched upon within what we've done so far.
And in that, while Maria's doing that, looking back at that, Jen, I see you got a question right here. How much meeting time do you give to your PLCs? My PLCs at my high school average 3 to 4 hours a week of meeting time. And I don't know how that compares to what you may have in your school, but I will tell you when we started the work, we were averaging 2 hours a month. So we made a huge commitment to finding more collaboration time because it was that valuable. Wow is right, Deb. It was a huge commitment, but again, that's how much value we put into the model and the process to be able to do the work to support CBE.
And at the elementary level, which is where I was at, we started with 45 minutes, and we had to be really clear about the difference between just common planning time, which can consist of many, many different things, and collaborative teaming time. So the work of professional learning communities. And again, those 4 critical questions can be the guide for you and were for us about how that time should be utilized. I will say that over time, our teachers were choosing during other common time to work collaboratively together, and much of their work, I won't say all of it, but much of their work was focused on one of those 4 critical questions.
Yeah. Amy, that is, to answer your question, it is during the school. 3 out of the 4 hours are during the school day. Then there's an additional hour after school. And Jen, your question of how we did it, that's probably a whole nother webinar. Maybe we can talk offline and I can show you our schedule if you want. Send me an email. I'd be happy to do that for you.
So Maria, I'm going to...
Yeah, you all are making it easy for me, but I am trying to keep up with questions that maybe haven't been hit on yet. And there's a number of questions about, you know, how do we get started right now? You know, and what are considerations for different types of learning environments. So for example, we have one question about how to do this in a middle school. What tools are available to set their progress, which I think is a good segue into our next portion. And also specifically, how would you implement this in an alternative program? So I know we don't have to answer all these questions specifically, but what are some reflections on lessons learned about adapting this work to different types of learning environments and different student needs?
Perfect. Well, Maria, that's a good summary, and I think for our next segue into the next piece, we'll be able to address some of those things. So actually, let's jump right into this next slide. You know, this came up for me, this whole idea of where do we start, where do we go next, what does it need to look like. We started wrestling with this early on. So in our journey, it was around 2010, 2011, we started doing this work. There wasn't a lot out there. You know, iNACOL provided some great resources through Competency Works websites. We were starting to connect with other schools that were starting to do the work, but we found a lot of us were in the same place. We didn't quite know what it needed to look like. We had a definition, but we didn't know how to make use of that definition and how to kind of build out a plan from there. I remember having a conversation with Chris Sturgis and Susan Patrick one day saying, you know, we're really at a point in my school and in the work that I'm doing with other schools where they're at what they would call an initiating level. They want to know what it looks like to advance to a developing level, what it looks like to start to advance to a more advanced level. And so I said, what have you got for tools? And they said, well, we don't really have a lot. We've got the definition, we've got research, we've got articles. So I said, well, I think we need to set our task to building a roadmap. We need some sort of a rubric to guide some of our work. So I took my cue, John and I, we took our cue from Great Schools Partnership that actually puts out some great rubrics that looks at all different aspects of school reform in school, but we wanted something that was going to be specific to the competency-based work and the competency-based definition. So that's what we built. We built a rubric. It's a tool that you can get right out of our solution tree book. You can go on the website, and if you sign up on the website, you can download the tool for free. And the tool is actually all 5 parts of the definition broken out so that you can look at what it actually looks like at an initiating, developing, or performing level. So right here we have, you're not actually looking at the tool, but you're looking at how the tool would be structured for the assessment tenet, where we separate that assessment tenet into assessment practices, grading practices, and system of calibration. And what is that? We actually talk about in the tool what it would look like to have a system of calibration that moves from the initiating level, building upon that to the developing, and building upon that to the performing level. So it was our first iteration. The tool actually predated our book. The whole reason that we wrote the book is because the tool got vetted by lots of different folks from iNACOL, some of the folks who are on this call today. And after the tool was vetted, a lot of people started using the tool, and more questions came about, and that's what brought about our need to write the book, to try to give some more structure to people as they were setting up to do some of the work for that. Maria, thank you for posting the link to the tools. So that was incredibly helpful. So then from there, we're going to advance. We'll advance our slide here. So, you know, the whole purpose that we built this tool was so that schools could start to map out their journey. And we use the word journey. You know, one of my colleagues and good dear friends, who I believe also I might have seen him on this call, Michael Termel, used to think about the work as being in a neighborhood. And there being, you know, in that neighborhood, you'd have to think about professional development. You'd have to think about your philosophies behind assessment and grading, and you'd navigate around this neighborhood in this map. And I think it's a great visual because it tells you how you're going to go on your journey. And I think that our tool, we hope that our tool helps you start to map out your journey. So honestly, the most important way that the reason we built the tool was so that people could self-assess. It starts by figuring out where your school is now, and then from there, where do you want to go, right? So there are some key questions that you want to think about as you start doing this work. So what design principles can you use to leverage that change, right? And are you going to be picking the design principle that perhaps you know you can make some early gains in? Is it going to be a design principle that you've identified as a system is your most critical need and your highest priority, and you're going to be dedicating a lot of resources to that? That's an important question you have to ask. You have to be thinking about the design principles for CBE that are going to be the most difficult or complex for you to implement. And you have to be thinking about that early, because you need to be able to anticipate what potential roadblocks they might be. Are they going to be resource roadblocks? Is it just going to be structure roadblocks? Is it going to be moving people's philosophy and thinking kinds of roadblocks? You want to start anticipating those so that you can start to map out where you need to move your resources in your efforts so that you'll be able to adjust them. And then, of course, the last big one is just where do you start and what kind of timeline is actually reasonable for the work? I mean, I'm sitting here telling you we come from schools that started talking about going to a CBE model in 2007. So that was 12 years ago, and we're saying we're not there yet. Now, granted, we'll never probably say that we were there yet, but we're on the journey, and we're moving in that direction. And I would say, you know, you need to be thinking, chunking out at least in 3 to 5 year spans in order to do this work. And then the tool, you use it to evaluate your progress on the journey so that you can set goals for each of those years.
Yeah, and part of it, obviously, what people tend to go to is what they aren't doing right away, but we want to make sure that the intent of the rubric is also to recognize and honor the great work that's already happening in schools. And we said at the beginning that each school or district may have a different entry point, and that's okay. It's about finding what's next and what will work for you. What are you already doing well? For example, if you have strong collaborative teams in place who are very highly functioning, they can really start to look at developing these assessments that are more performance-based, or looking at student data together, figuring out how they're going to support each learner where he or she is. So those pieces are critical. And I'll just share, I had a teacher come into my office at one point. We were about 5 years into the process. And she said, do you know what I realized? That we're never going to be, and she put this in quotes, we're never going to be there. And she said, and that's okay. And I think that really sums it up, that if we look at this as a process of always trying to refine what we're doing and get better at supporting our learners and do that collectively, then I think we're on the right track. We're going to move to this next slide here. So entry points.
Yeah, so just be thinking about that. You know, for us in our district, a lot of our work really started with assessment. We knew that assessment was going to be our driver because it was going to give us the purpose for a lot of the other work ahead. So be thinking about what your entry point would be. We'd love to see this in the chat as we're going through and buttoning things up in the last few minutes here. So go ahead and type that right into the chat. And we're going to turn things back over to Maria in just a second, but before we do that, she's going to talk to you a little bit about some policy work. We want to talk to you, we want to give you sort of a David Letterman style top 10 list, but we're going to call it our top 5 list. These are the things that for us have been tried and true, the things that it doesn't matter what school we've been in, these are things that we advise and things that we see that make the work successful. So starting right with number 5, it's going to be including all stakeholders in the work, making sure that everybody has a voice, that all voices are heard, that you work to reach consensus, which is when the will of the group is evident and all voices have been heard.
Absolutely. And number 4, make sure there is a lot of research out there about how this is best for kids and how this is supporting learning to a much higher level. And make sure you're aware of that. Again, we point to INACOL and Competency Works as just these places that we went to and could go to for that research that would help us with our community, with our teachers, and with our students.
Number 3 is don't compromise the model. We're not looking for CBE light or PLC light. If you're going to do it, you need to do it, and you can't be trying to make concessions because you're trying to compromise with folks who can't shift their thinking to something that's a little less traditional and a little bit more progressive.
And if we always keep students kind of at the center, then I think that helps. One of the things that I did with our staff was we made a list of how we made decisions and what we were focusing our time on. And over 90% of those, the time allocation was based upon adult-centered items of discussion. And we really wanted to keep student learning at the center. So if you can always bring it back to how it's going to impact your students or how it supports students, then that's a positive.
And the last one is don't wait. Start today. And this is especially for the educators in the room because you can do this at the classroom level. Remember, there's an ancient proverb that says the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. Well, the second best time is now.
And that actually came up in one of the chats about, how do you do this in your classroom if you're a single teacher trying to do it by him or herself. And you do what you can. And obviously we believe that a collaborative approach is more beneficial, but doing this even at the classroom level to the degree that you can is going to be helpful. Brian and I are going to turn things over to Maria at this point. We want to appreciate your deep engagement within the chat itself. We appreciate your time today. We know everybody is incredibly busy. Our contact information will be shared, and we'd encourage you to reach out to us for resources, or if you have questions, we're happy to help. And lastly, we're really excited to be offering a pre-conference session at the INACOL Symposium in October. And we're going to go even, today was more of like a 30,000-foot view about some of these structures and pieces, but during the pre-conference session, we're going to go much deeper and actually dig into the rubric itself. So we hope to see you at the symposium, and again, reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you, John and Brian. That was wonderful, and I feel really lucky to be alongside with you on this webinar and learning from you. And I actually had the opportunity to visit your district several years ago and learned a lot from that experience. So just to wrap things up, I wanted to, and my arrow has disappeared for advancing the slides, so bear with me. All right. Okay, and there's the book. If you go to the solutiontree.com, Breaking a Tradition, you'll be able to see some of the resources that were referenced. And again, I encourage you to join us at our symposium in Palm Springs on October 20th to 31st, where you can dig into a whole robust and exciting track on competency education. So I love the analogy that John and Brian ended with, that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, because that's really how I think about policy. It's about planting seeds and kind of tilling the earth and creating the fertile conditions for educators and leaders to be able to run with the things that are best for kids. And we have entry points for policy, too. I know there are a few policymakers on here today. There are ways you can think about entering this work as well that will open up space for the types of practices that Brian and John talked about today. So you can learn more about these entry points on our website. We have a number of policy briefs about this, but certainly opening flexibility through innovation zones or pilot programs is a great way to create that space for local innovators to jump into the work. And also, just going back to those three big ideas at the beginning, this idea of having a common purpose for where we want to go and where we want students to go. I think policymakers need to have that same sense of common purpose. We all need to have an understanding of what it means for students to truly be successful in life, not as learners and as members of a society. So with that, we are at time, but I just want to invite a virtual round of applause for our wonderful speakers today. And thanks to all of you for joining us and for your deep engagement in this conversation. And please, if you are not already on our mailing list, you can go to imacol.org and join us. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future, whether online or at our symposium. Thanks, everyone.